There's a rule on the Lower East Side. If you see blood on the pavement, you look the other way. You don't ask questions. You don't stop. Cora knew the rule. But when she found a man bleeding out next to the dumpsters behind her apartment, she didn't step over him. She gave him the only thing she had left in the world, her last hot meal. She thought she was saving a drifter. She was actually saving the devil himself. The rain didn't wash the city clean. It just made the grime slicker. Cora leaned her forehead against the freezing glass of the subway car, watching the blurred neon signs bleed into the puddles outside. Her feet throbbed in rhythm with the train on the tracks. 14 hours. 14 hours of carrying trays, dodging the grasping hands of drunk regulars, and smiling until her jaw felt wired shut. Her stomach gave a hollow, scraping growl. She looked down at the plastic bag resting in her lap. Inside was a styrofoam clamshell, holding a mountain of chicken and rice from the halal cart on 4th Street. It had cost her $6. That left exactly $4.12 in her checking account until Friday. But it was hot, it smelled heavily of cumin and garlic, and it was going to be the first decent thing she had eaten in 2 days. The train screeched to a halt at her stop. Cora pulled up the collar of her threadbare wool coat and stepped out into the freezing downpour. Her apartment building was a decaying brick structure, wedged between a discount liquor store and an abandoned laundromat. The front door's lock had been broken since August, meaning the hallway usually smelled of stale urine. To avoid it, Cora always took the alley to the fire escape. She turned the corner. The alley was pitch black, illuminated only by the erratic flicker of a dying sodium street lamp. Then she smelled it. Copper. Sharp, heavy, and undeniably metallic, cutting right through the stench of wet garbage. Cora froze. Her grip tightened on her plastic bag. She took a slow step backward. Look the other way, her brain screamed. Go back to the street. Walk around. A wet, ragged cough broke the silence. It came from the narrow space between the overflowing dumpsters and the brick wall. A shadow shifted. Cora's breath hitched in her throat. She couldn't see a face, just the sheer, terrifying bulk of a man slumped against the bricks. One of his legs was stretched out, his expensive leather shoe resting in a puddle of dirty water. The water around his shoe wasn't just dirty. It was dark. Thick. Don't! A voice rasped out of the dark. It was barely more than a whisper, but it carried the weight of a loaded gun. Don't run! Don't scream! Cora stood paralyzed. I'm just going to my apartment. Cell phone, the man breathed. He shifted, and the groan that followed was entirely involuntary, torn from the back of his throat. Take it out. I'll shoot you where you stand. Cora's hands opened in the cold air. I don't have it in my hand. I'm not calling the cops. She squinted. The dying street lamp flickered again, casting a brief, sickly yellow glow over him. He was wearing a dark suit, ruined now, plastered to his body with rain and blood. His left hand was clamped hard against his side, right just below the ribs. Blood seeped through his fingers, running down his wrist in a steady, terrifying stream. His right hand rested on his thigh. He wasn't bluffing. There was a matte black pistol gripped loosely in his fingers. Cora should have run. She had survived 24 years in this city by minding her own business. But she looked at the blood. There was so much of it. You're dying, she said. The observation fell flat, stripped of panic. Astute. He muttered his head, lolling slightly against the brick. Go inside. Forget you saw this. He was trying to sound menacing, but his voice was thinning out. Shock was setting in. Cora knew what shock looked like. Her father had looked just like that on the living room floor before the paramedics arrived too late. The pale, waxy skin, the tremors shivering through his broad shoulders. She took a step forward. The gun twitched upward. I said, "Go. Put that away. You don't even have the strength to lift it," Cora said, her voice surprisingly steady. She wasn't brave. She was just too tired to be terrified. She walked over to him, dropping to her knees on the wet asphalt. The smell of blood was suffocating up close. He tensed, trying to raise the weapon, but his eyes were glassy, struggling to focus on her face. He had striking features, hard and aristocratic, marred by a split lip and a dark bruise blooming across his jawline. "What are you doing?" he ground out. "Move your hand." Cora reached for the hem of her coat, bypassing it, to grab the thick flannel scarf wrapped around her neck. She tore it off. "Touch me and I kill you," he whispered, but there was no heat left in it. His eyes fluttered. "Shut up and move your hand." Cora didn't wait for his permission. She shoved his bloody hand aside and pressed the balled-up flannel scarf hard against the bullet wound in his side. He let out a sharp, choked gasp, his head snapping back against the brick. His free hand shot out, wrapping around her wrist in a vice grip. His fingers were freezing. "Keep the pressure on it," Cora said, ignoring the bruising pressure on her wrist. She guided his hand back over the makeshift bandage, pressing his palm down on top of the scarf. "You're losing too much blood. You need a hospital." "No hospitals," he breathed. "No cops. Then you're going to bleed out in a puddle of garbage juice," she replied flatly. He managed a weak, bitter smirk. Better than the alternative. His head tilted, and his eyes slid shut. He was fading. The adrenaline that had kept him talking was running dry. His body needed energy fuel to keep the heart pumping against the rapid loss of fluids. Cora looked down at her lap. The white plastic bag was resting against her knees. She could feel the heat radiating from the styrofoam container. Her stomach cramped violently, reminding her of her own hunger. It was her last meal. Tomorrow was going to be a long, brutal day of black coffee and tap water. She cursed under her breath. "Hey," she said, tapping his cheek with 2 fingers. "Hey, open your eyes." He groaned, his eyelids heavy as they cracked open. Cora popped the styrofoam container open. Steam rose into the freezing air, carrying the heavy scent of roasted meat and rice. She broke off a large piece of the chicken, ignoring the grease coating her fingers, and held it to his mouth. "Eat it." He stared at her confusion, warring with the haze of pain. "What?" "Protein. Carbs. You're going into shock. Your body needs something to burn if you're going to stay conscious long enough for whoever you're waiting for to scrape you off this pavement." Cora said, her tone completely devoid of pity. It was mechanical, practical. He didn't move. "I'm not poisoning you," she snapped. "If I wanted you dead, I'd just walk away. Open your mouth." Slowly, hesitantly, he parted his lips. Cora fed him the food. He chewed slowly, mechanically, his eyes never leaving her face. The dark, bottomless black of his pupils seemed to swallow the dim light of the alley. For 10 minutes, the only sound was the rain hitting the dumpsters. She sat in the puddle feeding him pieces of chicken and handfuls of rice, keeping his hand pressed firmly against the bloody scarf with her other hand. When the container was empty, Cora tossed it into the nearest dumpster. She wiped her greasy hands on her jeans. A pair of headlights swept across the brick wall at the mouth of the alley. An engine idled a low, heavy purr that didn't sound like a police cruiser. The man's body tensed. He let out a long, ragged exhale. "My ride." Cora stood up quickly. Her knees popped, protesting the cold and the awkward angle. "Keep the pressure on," she ordered, looking down at him. He looked up at her. The haze in his eyes had cleared just a fraction, replaced by something sharp and calculating. He took in her frayed coat, the dark circles under her eyes, the cheap boots soaked through with alley water. "Who are you?" he asked. The rasp was still there, but the authority had returned. "Nobody," Cora said. She turned around and walked to the fire escape, pulling the rusted ladder down with a harsh squeal of metal. She didn't look back. By the time she climbed to her third-floor window and crawled inside her dark, freezing apartment, the alley below was empty. All that was left was a dark stain on the pavement, rapidly washing away in the rain. 3 days passed. The encounter in the alley felt like a fever dream, easily buried under the crushing weight of Cora's reality. There was no time to dwell on bleeding strangers when the eviction notice taped to her door was bright pink and threatening. "Order up 2 Western omelettes, 1 stack of pancakes, extra syrup." Pop's voice boomed from the pass-through window, cutting through the clatter of silverware and the low hum of the diner's ventilation fan. "Coming, Pop," Cora called out, grabbing a rag to wipe down the counter before grabbing the heavy ceramic plates. Pop's diner was a relic. Nestled on the corner of 9th and Elm, it boasted cracked red vinyl booths, a black and white checkered floor that had long turned yellow, and coffee that tasted faintly of burned pennies. But Pop was a good man. He was in his 60s, balding with a thick mustache, and hands scarred from decades over a flat-top grill. He paid Cora in cash under the table, which kept the debt collectors off her neck, even if it barely covered her rent. Cora balanced the plates on her forearm and wove through the crowded narrow aisle. It was the Tuesday lunch rush. The air was thick with the smell of bacon grease and stale cigarette smoke drifting in from the open door. She set the plates down in front of 2 construction workers, flashed a tired, practiced smile, and turned back to the counter. Her back ached. Her feet felt like they were packed with lead. She hadn't eaten a full meal since the chicken and rice in the alley, subsisting on half-eaten pieces of toast Pop let her take from the kitchen, and endless cups of black coffee to kill her appetite. The hunger was a dull, constant ache behind her ribs. "Cora Hon, you look like hell," Betty said, leaning against the pie case. Betty was the only other waitress, a woman in her 50s, whose hair was teased so high it defied physics. "Thanks, Betty. You always know exactly what to say to make a girl feel special," Cora replied dryly, tallying a receipt on her notepad. "I'm just saying, you need a day off, or a hot meal." Cora's pencil paused on the paper. She pushed the memory of the bloody alley away. "I need rent money, Betty. Unless the pies start tipping, I'm working." The bell above the diner door jingled. The sound was normal, but the sudden heavy silence that rolled through the room wasn't. The clatter of forks against plates ceased. The low murmur of conversation died in throats. Cora looked up from her notepad. 3 men walked through the door. They didn't fit the diner's aesthetic of blue-collar workers and tired locals. They wore leather jackets over dark shirts. The man in the lead, a heavy-set guy with a thick neck and a jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow, had a swagger that took up too much oxygen in the small room. It was Tommy the Wrench Silver. Cora's stomach plummeted. Tommy was a bottom feeder, a mid-level enforcer for the local syndicate that ran the protection rackets in the neighborhood. They usually showed up on the 1st of the month. Today was the 18th. Tommy didn't bother looking for a table. He walked straight up to the counter, his heavy boots thudding against the linoleum. He planted his hands on the formica surface, leaning over to look past Cora into the kitchen. "Hey, Pop!" Tommy called out, his voice a booming artificial chair. "Grill's smelling good today. Mind stepping out here for a second?" Pop appeared at the window, a spatula in his hand. The color had entirely drained from his face. "Tommy, it's not the 1st. "Yeah, I know how a calendar works, old man," Tommy said, tapping a thick finger against the counter. "But things are changing. Management restructuring, you could say. The rates went up." Pop wiped his hands on his apron, his hands visibly shaking. "I paid you 2 weeks ago. I gave you everything I had. I barely made payroll. That sounds like a you problem. Pop. Tommy sighed, shaking his head with mock sympathy. One of the men behind him chuckled. See the new boss he's consolidating, restoring order, and order costs money. We need another $1,000. Today. $1,000! Pop's voice cracked. I don't have $1,000 in the register. I don't have it in the bank. Then I guess we're going to have to start taking collateral, Tommy said. He casually reached out and grabbed the metal napkin dispenser off the counter, weighing it in his hand before casually tossing it over his shoulder. It hit a nearby table, shattering a glass of water and sending a patron scrambling backward. Cora didn't think. The exhaustion, the hunger, the constant grinding anxiety of her life snapped something tight and brittle inside her chest. She stepped directly in front of Tommy, blocking his view of Pop. He said he doesn't have it, Cora said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was hard. Get out, you're scaring the customers. Tommy blinked, looking down at her, as if a mouse had just barked at him. He let out a short, incredulous laugh. Excuse me, sweetheart. Are you lost? I'm working, Cora said, gripping her notepad so tightly her knuckles were white. And you're interrupting my shift. He pays you on the first. Come back then. The amusement vanished from Tommy's face, replaced by a sudden, ugly violence. He leaned in his breath, smelling of stale coffee and stale beer. Listen to me, you little bitch. I don't take orders from waitresses. Move before I remodel this place with your face. He reached out his thick hand, grabbing Cora's shoulder. His grip was bruising, digging into her collarbone. He went to shove her aside. Cora planted her feet, grabbing a scalding pot of coffee from the burner behind her, with her free hand ready to throw it squarely into his eyes. She wasn't going down without a fight. But before she could move, the bell above the door jingled again. The jingling of the bell was light, almost cheerful, but the effect it had on the room was absolute. Tommy stopped moving. His hand remained clamped on Cora's shoulder, but the pressure loosened slightly. The two thugs standing behind him straightened up their swagger, evaporating instantly. The air in the diner seemed to grow cold, sucking the oxygen out of the room. Cora, still holding the coffee pot, turned her head toward the door. A man stood just inside the threshold. He wasn't particularly large, not compared to Tommy's bulky frame, but he commanded the space the moment he occupied it. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that draped flawlessly over his shoulders, paired with a black silk tie and an overcoat that hung open. His dark hair was immaculately styled, pushing back from a face that looked like it had been carved from marble. Hard jaw, straight nose, sharp cheekbones. There was no blood on him today. The bruising on his jaw was fading into a faint yellow, barely noticeable. But Cora recognized the eyes. Dark, bottomless, and completely devoid of warmth. It was the man from the alley. He didn't look at Cora. He didn't look at Pop. His gaze was fixed entirely on Tommy's hand, which was still resting on Cora's shoulder. "Tommy," the man said. His voice wasn't a yell. It was barely above a conversational volume, a low, smooth baritone. But it carried across the diner like a physical blow. Tommy dropped his hand from Cora as if her skin had suddenly caught fire. He took a hasty step backward, his massive frame shrinking in on itself. "Mr. Costa, we weren't expecting you down here." Gabriel Costa. The name clicked in Cora's mind, bringing a sudden wave of icy dread. Everyone in the city knew the name Costa. They were the apex predators. They didn't shake down diners for a few $100. They bought the politicians who zoned the blocks. Gabriel stepped fully into the diner. Two massive men in dark suits flanked the door behind him, crossing their arms. They looked like moving mountains. Gabriel walked slowly toward the counter. The only sound in the room was the quiet click of his polished shoes on the linoleum. He stopped 2 feet away from Tommy. "I was doing an audit," Gabriel said quietly, adjusting his cuffs. "Reviewing the territory after the transition of power last week. Imagine my surprise when I find you shaking down a diner that isn't on the collection ledger." Tommy swallowed hard. Sweat beaded on his forehead. "Mr. Costa Rye, the old boss, he let us handle the loose change on these blocks. I was just trying to increase the margins for the family." "The old boss is dead," Gabriel stated. The absolute lack of emotion in his voice was terrifying. "And I don't authorize unauthorized collections. It's sloppy. It breeds resentment. It makes us look like street thugs." He looked Tommy up and down with clinical disgust. "Which apparently some of us still are." "It won't happen again, boss. I swear." Tommy stammered, raising his hands in surrender. "You're right. It won't." Gabriel didn't raise a hand. He didn't gesture. He simply tilted his head a fraction of an inch toward the door. The two men standing at the entrance moved with terrifying speed. Before Tommy could react, one of them grabbed him by the back of the neck, hauling him backward. The second thug was already dragging Tommy's two companions out by their collars. The door shut behind them. Through the glass, Cora saw them being shoved into the back of a black SUV, idling at the curb. The diner was perfectly silent. Pop was frozen at the grill. Betty was clutching the pie case like a life preserver. Gabriel turned slowly back to the counter. He took a seat on one of the red vinyl stools right in front of Cora. He smoothed his tie, resting his hands on the formica surface. He looked at her. Really looked at her. His eyes tracked from her messy hair, down to the exhausted bags under her eyes, and finally settled on her name tag pinned to her stained apron. Cora. He didn't smile, but something shifted in his expression. The predatory coldness banked, replaced by something heavier, something observant. "Coffee, please," Gabriel said quietly. Cora stood frozen, still holding the scalding pot. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. This was the man she had yelled at. This was the man she had shoved chicken into. She had barked orders at the head of the Costa family while he bled in the garbage. She swallowed the dry lump in her throat, forcing her hands to stop shaking. She grabbed a clean ceramic mug from beneath the counter, set it in front of him, and poured the dark liquid. She didn't spill a drop. "Cream or sugar?" she asked, her voice cracked slightly, betraying her. Gabriel looked down at the steaming mug, then back up into her eyes. "Black is fine," he said softly. "I'm not picky about what I consume when I'm desperate." The words hung in the air between them, thick with a shared secret. He knew. He remembered exactly who she was. He reached inside his suit jacket. Pop whimpered from the kitchen, assuming a weapon was coming out. Instead, Gabriel withdrew a sleek silver money clip. He peeled off a crisp $100 bill and laid it flat on the counter next to his coffee. Then he peeled off another, and another, and another. He set $500 on the counter. "For the coffee," Gabriel said. He picked up the mug, took a sip, and didn't break eye contact. "And for the chicken. You cook a decent bird, Cora." He stood up, leaving the coffee nearly untouched, and the money sitting on the counter. He buttoned his suit jacket, turned, and walked out the door. The bell jingled merrily in his wake. Cora stood behind the counter, staring at the stack of bills. The grinding gears of her life had just jumped the track, and she had a terrifying feeling she was about to crash. The $500 sat on the chipped formica counter for a full minute after Gabriel Costa walked out. No one breathed. The diner felt like a pressure cooker that had just been unsealed, the air slowly hissing out of the room. Pop broke the silence. He stumbled out of the kitchen, his apron smeared with grease and his face the color of old ash. He stared at the bills, then looked at the door. "Cora," Pop whispered, his voice trembling. What did you do?" "I poured him a cup of coffee," Cora said. Her voice sounded detached, echoing in her own ears. "Gabriel Costa doesn't tip $500 for diner coffee. Gabriel Costa doesn't walk into places like this unless he's buying the block or burning it down." Pop reached out with a shaking hand and pushed the money toward her. "Take it. Get it off my counter. Put it in your pocket, and don't ever tell anyone where it came from." Cora stared at the money. 5 crisp $100 bills. Benjamin Franklin's face looked up at her, indifferent to the blood and extortion that had undoubtedly put him in Costa's silver money clip. It was rent. It was heat. It was groceries for a month. She reached out and snatched the bills. The paper felt heavy, dirty. She folded the money twice, shoved it deep into the pocket of her jeans, and went back to wiping down the counters. She worked mechanically, ignoring the lingering stares of the remaining customers. She needed to keep her hands moving so they wouldn't shake. When her shift ended, the sky over the city was the color of bruised iron. A bitter wind whipped down the concrete canyons, biting through her thin wool coat. Cora walked the 3 blocks to her apartment, her hand shoved in her pocket fingers tight around the folded bills. She didn't go up the fire escape this time. She walked straight through the front door with the broken lock, bypassed the stairs, and knocked on the super's door on the ground floor. Henderson opened it. He was a man who smelled perpetually of stale beer and cheap cigars, wearing a stained undershirt that stretched over a prominent gut. "Rent's late, Cora," he grunted, leaning against the doorframe. "I got the eviction papers ready." Cora pulled 3 of the $100 bills from her pocket and shoved them into his chest. Henderson blinked, catching the money before it fell. He looked at the bills, then up at her, his eyes narrowing with sudden sleazy suspicion. 300. That covers this month and the late fee. Where'd a waitress get bills this crisp? I robbed a bank, Henderson. Give me a receipt. He scoffed, pulling a crumpled receipt book from his back pocket and scribbling on it. He tore the yellow slip out and handed it to her. "Whatever you're doing on the side, don't bring that heat to my building." "Just fix the front door lock." Cora shot back, turning on her heel and taking the stairs 2 at a time. She locked her apartment door behind her, throwing the deadbolt and sliding the chain into place. The apartment was freezing. The radiator hissed weakly in the corner, offering nothing but noise. Cora didn't take off her coat. She sat on the edge of her mattress, staring at the remaining $200 in her hand. She had bought herself another 30 days of shelter. But as she looked out her grime-streaked window onto the street below, the victory tasted like ash. Parked across the street, idling in front of the discount liquor store, was a black Lincoln Navigator. Its windows were tinted pitch black. It sat there for an hour, then 2. It didn't move. No one got in, no one got out. The predators of the city didn't just forget. Gabriel Costa had paid his debt for the chicken and rice. But in his world, a ledger was never truly closed. Cora pulled the blinds shut. She slept in her coat, the 2 remaining bills tucked inside her pillowcase, listening to the heavy purr of the engine 3 floors down. The black SUV followed her for 4 days. It was never aggressive. It never cut her off or blocked her path. It was just there, a shadow lurking at the edge of her peripheral vision. When she walked to the subway at dawn, it idled at the corner. When she left the diner after the dinner rush, it was parked down the block, headlights off, engine humming. It was psychological warfare, a silent reminder that she existed entirely at the whim of forces she couldn't control. On the 5th night, the rain returned, an icy deluge that turned the city streets into black mirrors. Cora stepped out of the diner, pulling her collar up against the biting wind. She was exhausted. Her bones ached with a deep, persistent cold. She turned the corner toward the subway station. A figure stepped out from the shelter of a closed newsstand, blocking the narrow sidewalk. Cora stopped cold. Her hand instinctively drifted toward the heavy metal flashlight she kept in her purse. The man raised his hands, palms out in a placating gesture. He was older perhaps, in his 50s, with silver hair meticulously combed back, and a tailored navy suit that likely cost more than Cora made in a year. He carried an expensive black umbrella, holding it perfectly straight. "Miss Cora," the man said. His voice was smooth-cultured and devoid of the rough street accent Tommy had possessed. "My name is Leo. I work for Mr. Costa." Cora's grip tightened on the flashlight. "I don't care who you work for. Get out of my way." Leo didn't move. He didn't look offended, merely patient. "Mr. Costa would like to invite you to dinner. He's waiting in the car." He gestured slightly with his free hand toward the curb. The black Lincoln Navigator was parked there, rain slicking off its polished chassis. The rear passenger door swung open, smoothly pushed from the inside. "I already ate," Cora lied. "It wasn't a request, Miss Cora. It's an invitation." Leo's smile didn't reach his eyes. "There is a distinct difference, but the outcome is generally the same. Please, it's freezing out here, and Gabriel is not a man who enjoys waiting." Cora looked at the open door of the SUV. The interior was swathed in warm, amber light, showcasing cream leather and polished wood. Then she looked down the dark, empty street. She could scream. She could run. But she knew the reality of her neighborhood. If Gabriel Costa wanted her in that car, she was getting in that car. Running would only make it violent. She let go of the flashlight. She walked past Leo, stepped up into the heavy vehicle, and pulled the door shut behind her. The silence inside the cabin was absolute, instantly cutting off the roar of the rain and the city. It smelled of rich leather and an expensive, subtle cologne, pine and bergamot. Gabriel sat in the seat opposite her. He was out of his suit jacket, wearing only a crisp white dress shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms and a black vest. In the dim light, the brutal geometry of his face was softened, but his eyes were just as sharp. He held a crystal tumbler of amber liquid, resting it on his knee. "You're shivering," Gabriel noted. "Your goon ambushed me in a monsoon." "I'm fine," Cora said tightly. She pressed herself against the door, putting as much space between them as the spacious cabin allowed. Gabriel tapped the privacy glass, separating them from the driver. The heavy SUV smoothly pulled away from the curb. "Leo isn't a goon. He's an advisor," Gabriel corrected mildly. He reached out and pressed a button on a console. A wave of warm air instantly flooded the back seat, thawing the ice from Cora's damp clothes. "And I apologize for the theatrics. You're a difficult woman to approach in a conventional manner." "Most people just say hello," Cora said. "They don't stalk a person for a week in a hearse." Gabriel took a slow sip from his tumbler. The corner of his mouth twitched upward, a ghost of a smile that vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Precaution. You saved my life. Then you stood between a raging bull and a terrified old man, over $1,000. I needed to know if you were incredibly brave or just incredibly stupid. Did you figure it out?" "I think you're tired," Gabriel said softly. The observation was entirely too perceptive, slicing right through her defenses. "I think you're so tired of being pushed around that the fear just burned itself out." Cora stared at him. "Where are we going? I owe you a meal. You left $500 on a diner counter. We're square." "Not even close," Gabriel murmured, leaning back into the leather. "Money is easy. Money is cheap. You gave me the food off your own plate when you were starving. You ripped your own clothing to stop my bleeding. You didn't ask for a reward, and you didn't call the police. You can't put a price tag on that kind of loyalty." "It wasn't loyalty. It was basic human decency. Gabriel laughed. It was a dark, hollow sound that held no humor. Human decency. I haven't seen that in a very long time. Welcome to my world, Cora. The SUV pulled to a smooth halt. Cora looked out the tinted window. They weren't at a restaurant. They were parked in a private subterranean loading dock surrounded by concrete pillars and steel doors. Gabriel set his glass down. Come, let's eat. Gabriel led her through a heavy steel door and into a service elevator. They rode in silence to the penthouse level. When the doors parted, Cora stepped into a space that defied the gritty reality of the city below. It was a sprawling loft, encased entirely in floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooked the glittering skyline. The floors were dark, polished hardwood. Modern minimalist art hung on the walls. It was immaculate, sterile, and breathtakingly expensive. In the center of the massive room was a dining table set for two. A private chef in a pristine white coat was just placing silver covers over the plates. He bowed slightly to Gabriel and vanished into a back kitchen without a word. Sit, Gabriel offered, pulling out a chair for her. Cora didn't move. She stood in the center of the room, her scuffed, wet boots a glaring contrast against the polished floor. Her cheap, damp coat dripped onto the hardwood. I don't belong here, she said flatly. You belong wherever I invite you, Gabriel replied. The authority in his voice was effortless. It wasn't a threat. It was a simple statement of fact as he saw the world. He walked over to a wet bar, pouring himself a glass of water, giving her space. Take off your coat, Cora. Sit down. Eat. I promise the food is better than what you pull out of a styrofoam box in an alley. Her stomach betrayed her with a loud, hollow growl. The smell permeating the room, roasted garlic, seared steak truffle, was intoxicating. She was hungry. She was always hungry. Reluctantly, she shrugged off her damp coat, draping it over the back of a chair, and sat down. Gabriel took the seat opposite her. He lifted the silver covers. Beneath were perfectly seared filet mignons, resting on beds of whipped potatoes, asparagus, and a dark, rich demi-glace. Cora picked up her fork. She didn't wait for him to start. She cut a piece of the meat and put it in her mouth. It melted like butter. She closed her eyes for a brief second, allowing herself to just taste it, pushing the anxiety down. Gabriel didn't eat. He simply watched her. His dark eyes tracked the movement of her hands, the way she chewed the tension in her shoulders. Why did you do it? Gabriel asked, abruptly, breaking the silence. Cora swallowed. Do what? Save me. You knew what I was. If not the exact name, you saw the gun. You saw the suit. You knew I was dangerous. You had exactly $4 in your bank account, and you gave me a $6 meal. Why? Cora paused, her knife resting against the china plate. She looked at him. The fading bruise on his jaw was barely a shadow now. He looked invincible, sitting here in his glass tower. But she remembered the tremors. She remembered the cold sweat on his skin. My father died of a heart attack when I was 19, Cora said. The words tasted like copper, an old wound reopened. He collapsed in the living room. It took the ambulance 30 minutes to get to our neighborhood. I sat with him while he died. I watched the light go out of his eyes. Gabriel's expression didn't shift, but the stillness in him deepened. I know what it looks like when a man is at the absolute end of his rope. Cora continued, returning her gaze to her plate. When you were bleeding by those dumpsters, you weren't a boss. You weren't a gangster. You were just a dying man in the dark. I didn't want to watch another man die on the floor. Gabriel absorbed this. He slowly picked up his own fork, but he just used it to push a piece of asparagus across his plate. I ran a background check on you, Gabriel said quietly. Cora's head snapped up. Anger flared hot and sudden, burning through the intimidation. "Excuse me." Cora Davis, 24, dropped out of community college to pay off your father's medical debts. You work 60 hours a week at a diner that barely stays afloat. You have zero criminal record, no living relatives, and you were nearly evicted 3 days ago until you paid your landlord with my money. You have no right to look into my life. Cora snapped her knuckles, turning white around her fork. I have every right. Gabriel countered his voice, remaining level, entirely undisturbed by her anger. You injected yourself into my life. In my line of work, unknown variables are fatal. I had to know if you were a plant, an assassin, or a spy. And what did you find out? She demanded, glaring at him. That you are exactly what you appear to be. A civilian. A desperately unlucky, aggressively stubborn civilian. Gabriel set his fork down and leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. Which brings us to the ledger. I told you we are square. No, Cora, we aren't. Gabriel reached inside his vest pocket. He pulled out a sleek, black leather checkbook and a silver fountain pen. He set them on the table between them. I owe you my life. In my family, a life debt is a sacred thing. It cannot be ignored. He uncapped the pen and pushed the checkbook toward her. Write a number, Gabriel commanded softly. Any number. Enough to buy your building. Enough to leave the city. Enough to never carry a tray of cheap coffee again. Write it down and it's yours. Free and clear. Cora looked at the blank check. The signature at the bottom was Gabriel Costa. The account was likely large enough to rival the GDP of a small country. She could write down $1 million. 10 million. He wouldn't blink. She looked from the check to Gabriel's face. He looked satisfied, relieved even. He was comfortable here in the realm of transactions. This was how he understood the world. Everything had a price. Everyone could be bought. If he paid her, the debt was settled. The anomaly was categorized and filed away. Cora slowly picked up the silver pen. It was heavy, perfectly balanced. Gabriel leaned back, watching her, waiting for the inevitable capitulation. Cora capped the pen. She set it down gently next to her plate. She didn't touch the checkbook. No, Cora said. Gabriel's brow furrowed slightly. The satisfaction vanished. No. I don't want your money, Gabriel, she said, using his first name for the first time. It felt dangerous in her mouth. I didn't save you for a payday. I saved you because it was the right thing to do. There is no right thing, Gabriel said, his voice dropping an octave, a sudden harsh edge, cutting through his polished veneer. There is only survival and leverage. Take the money, Cora. Let me balance the scales. You can't. Cora stood up. She grabbed her damp coat from the back of the chair. Because if I take your money, it means what I did was a transaction. It means I'm just another person on your payroll. And I'm not. She pulled the coat on, buttoning it with steady fingers. Gabriel remained seated, but the energy rolling off him was electric dangerous. The room suddenly felt very small. I gave you my last meal because I chose to, Cora said, looking down at him. It was a gift. You can't buy a gift, Gabriel. You just have to live with it. She turned and walked toward the private elevator. She fully expected him to stop her, to order his guards to drag her back. Her heart hammered in her throat with every step. She hit the call button. The doors slid open. Gabriel didn't move. He sat at the table framed by the glittering city lights, staring at the blank check. Have Leo take you home? Gabriel called out, his voice, quiet, carrying effortlessly across the large room. It's still raining. Cora stepped into the elevator. As the doors closed, she saw him pick up the silver pen, staring at it, like it was a foreign object. She had walked away. But as the elevator plummeted back down to the street, Cora knew, with a sinking certainty, that she hadn't ended anything. She had just rewritten the rules of a game she didn't know how to play. Gabriel Costa didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in bullet trajectories, compound interest, and the inherent predictable greed of men. But for 3 days, the silver fountain pen sitting on his mahogany desk haunted him. He sat in the dimly lit study of his penthouse, the city sprawling below him like a circuit board of pulsing yellow lights. Across the desk sat Dominic, his underboss. Dominic was a man carved from old-world brutality, his knuckles heavily scarred, his suits tailored specifically to hide the shoulder rig he never took off. Dominic slid a manila folder across the polished wood. The waterfront project, Dominic rasped, tapping the thick cardboard. The union rep is balking, says the pension fund contribution isn't enough to look the other way on the concrete shipments. He wants another 5 points. Gabriel looked at the folder. He didn't open it. Tell him he gets 2 points, or he gets replaced by someone who understands basic math. He's got leverage, Gabe. The strike vote is tomorrow. He has the illusion of leverage. Gabriel corrected his voice, flat. He picked up the silver pen, turning it slowly between his long fingers. The metal was cold. Everyone thinks they have leverage until the ground disappears beneath them. Break his brother's jaw. Tell him the next break is a femur. He'll sign. Dominic nodded, once taking the folder back. He lingered, his eyes dropping to the pen in Gabriel's hand. You've been distracted. Dominic noted his tone, careful. In their world, observation was survival. Leo said you pulled the surveillance off the waitress. You let her walk away with the debt unsettled. Gabriel stopped spinning the pen. He looked up, his dark eyes locking onto Dominic. The air in the room instantly dropped 10 degrees. My debts are my business, Dom, Gabriel said softly. The surveillance was pulled because she isn't a threat. She's a civilian. She saw your face in the alley. She knows Tommy. She knows the structure. Dominic shifted his weight. She's an exposed wire. You know the protocol. The protocol applies to enemies. She fed me. She's a liability. Gabriel stood up. It was a slow, fluid motion, but it carried the terrifying implication of a predator uncoiling. He planted his hands flat on the desk, leaning in. If a single hair on Cora Davis's head is touched by you, by Tommy, by anyone in this family. Gabriel said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. I will dismantle you. I won't just kill you. I will erase your name, empty your accounts, and burn the ground your house stands on. Are we absolutely clear? Dominic swallowed hard, the scar tissue on his jaw going pale. He dipped his chin. Crystal Boss. Get out. When the heavy oak door clicked shut, Gabriel sank back into his leather chair. He dropped the pen onto the blotter. He rubbed his face with both hands, feeling the faint, lingering ache in his side, where the bullet had torn through muscle and tissue. Cora had ruined him. He had spent 30 years building an armor of absolute transactional apathy. You give, you get. You owe, you pay. You bleed, you die. It was a clean, mathematical way to view a filthy world, but Cora had broken the math. It was a gift. The concept was entirely alien to him. Gifts came with strings. Gifts were bribes dressed up in shiny paper. But he had looked into her exhausted, defiant eyes and seen nothing but terrifying, unadulterated sincerity. She didn't want his money. She didn't want his power. She just wanted him to live. It made him feel something he hadn't felt since he was a child bleeding in the gutters of this very city. It made him feel vulnerable. Down in the gutters, 20 blocks away, Cora was discovering the cost of her pride. She stood in the fluorescent-lit aisle of a discount bodega, staring at a can of generic chicken noodle soup. It was $1.49. She checked the crumpled bills in her palm. 2 singles a quarter and 3 dimes. $2.55. She could afford the soup. She couldn't afford the soup and a loaf of bread. She put the soup back on the shelf, grabbing a 99-cent bag of dried lentils instead. Lentils went further. They just tasted like dirt. Her back ached from a double shift. Pop's diner had been slammed all day, the ventilation fan broken, leaving the air thick and greasy. She smelled like old bacon and stale coffee. She thought about the blank check. She pushed the thought away violently. If she took that money, she would be validating everything Gabriel Costa believed about the world. She would become a line item on a gangster's spreadsheet. Her father had always told her that the only thing a poor person truly owned was their integrity. Once you sold it, you could never buy it back, no matter how rich you got. Cora paid for the lentils, stepping out into the freezing night air. The rain had stopped, leaving the sidewalks slick and shining under the amber streetlights. She tightened her scarf and began the 6-block walk back to her apartment. The streets were quiet. Too quiet. The usual hum of traffic was muted, the corner boys nowhere to be seen. Cora's instincts, honed by years of living on the edge, flared to life. The hairs on her arms stood up. She quickened her pace, her boots slapping against the wet concrete. She reached her block. The broken street lamp halfway down the alley meant the entrance to her fire escape was swallowed in pitch black. She didn't look over her shoulder. She just walked faster, her hand dipping into her worn canvas tote bag, her fingers wrapping tightly around the cold, heavy metal of the flashlight she always carried. She reached the mouth of the alley. A heavy hand clamped down on her shoulder from behind the grip, violently tearing her backward. Cora slammed hard against the rough brick wall of the liquor store. The breath was knocked out of her lungs in a sharp, agonizing rush. Her tote bag fell to the wet pavement, the bag of lentils spilling out into a muddy puddle. She gasped, her vision swimming, trying to focus on the massive shape standing over her. The smell hit her first: stale beer, cheap cigarettes, and raw, ugly sweat. "Hello, sweetheart." Tommy Silver stood there. He wasn't wearing his expensive leather jacket tonight. He looked disheveled, frantic. The swagger was gone, replaced by the cornered animal desperation of a man who had lost everything. His left eye was severely bruised, the skin around it split and stitched. Behind him stood 2 other men. Not the polished thugs Gabriel employed. These were street muscle, junkies looking for a quick payout. "Tommy!" Cora choked out, trying to push herself flat against the brick. "You ruined my life," Tommy spat, stepping closer. He pulled a heavy steel tire iron from his belt, tapping it against his palm. "I got stripped of my territory, humiliated in front of the whole family. And all because I tried to collect from a rundown diner, and you had to play hero." "I didn't do anything to you," Cora said, her voice shaking. She subtly slid her right hand down her side, searching for the fallen tote bag in the dark. "You got the boss's ear. You think you're untouchable now?" Tommy laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "Costa ain't here tonight. Costa don't care about a dead waitress in a gutter. He only cares about the ledger. And you ain't on it." He raised the tire iron. Cora's fingers brushed the canvas strap of her bag. She didn't hesitate. She didn't scream. Screaming in this neighborhood was just asking people to lock their doors tighter. She lunged forward, not away from him, but directly into his guard. She brought her right hand up the heavy metal flashlight, gripped tight, and drove it directly into the center of Tommy's bruised face. The crunch of cartilage was sickeningly loud. Tommy screamed a high-pitched wail of agony, dropping the tire iron and clutching his nose. Blood sprayed across Cora's coat. She didn't stop to admire her work. She shoved past him, sprinting wildly toward the street. She needed light. She needed traffic. One of the junkies grabbed the back of her coat. The cheap wool tore, but the momentum halted her. He spun her around, a rusted switchblade clicking open in his hand. Cora swung the flashlight wildly, catching him on the collarbone. He grunted, but didn't let go, raising the knife. Suddenly the night erupted in blinding white light. A pair of high-beam headlights flared from the end of the street, cutting through the darkness like physical blades. The roar of a massive engine drowned out Tommy's screaming. The black Lincoln Navigator didn't brake. It accelerated. It jumped the curb with a violent crunch of metal against concrete, tearing the front bumper of a parked sedan clean off. It barreled straight toward the alley entrance. The junkie holding Cora froze, blinded by the lights. The SUV slammed on the brakes inches from them, tires screaming against the wet asphalt, the smell of burning rubber filling the air. Before the vehicle even completely stopped, the rear door kicked open. Gabriel Costa stepped out. He wasn't wearing a tailored suit. He wore a dark sweater and black slacks, moving with a fluid, terrifying velocity that Cora had never seen. The composed, aristocratic boss sitting in the glass penthouse was gone. This was the predator that ruled the underworld. He didn't speak. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply walked up to the man holding the knife, grabbed his wrist with one hand, and brutally drove the heel of his other hand upward into the man's elbow joint. The bone snapped with a sound like a dry branch breaking. The man dropped the knife, collapsing to the pavement, shrieking. The second junkie took one look at Gabriel's face, dropped his weapon, and bolted down the alley into the darkness. Gabriel didn't chase him. He stepped over the writhing man and walked toward Tommy, who was on his knees, blood pouring from his shattered nose. Tommy looked up. His eyes widened in absolute paralyzing terror. "Boss! Boss, please! I didn't know!" Gabriel kicked him squarely in the chest. Tommy flew backward, slamming his head against the brick wall. He slumped sideways, gasping for air. Gabriel stepped on Tommy's right hand, pinning it to the asphalt. He leaned down his face, entirely devoid of emotion. It was a mask of cold, infinite violence. "I told Dominic," Gabriel whispered, his voice carrying clearly over the idling engine of the SUV. "I told him the protocol." He raised his foot and brought his heavy leather shoe down violently on Tommy's knee. Tommy's scream was abruptly cut short as he passed out from the pain. Gabriel stood up, adjusting the cuffs of his sweater. He looked down at the unconscious men, then slowly turned his head to look at Cora. Cora was pressed against the wall, her chest heaving, the flashlight still gripped tightly in her white-knuckled hand. Her coat was torn, her hand scraped and bleeding from where she had hit the wall. Gabriel walked toward her. He stopped 2 feet away, stopping just outside her personal space. The blinding headlights of the SUV framed him in silhouette. He looked at the blood on her face, Tommy's blood, and a muscle ticked violently in his jaw. "Drop the flashlight, Cora," Gabriel said softly. She stared at him, her breathing ragged. She didn't drop it. Gabriel slowly raised his hands, palms open a mirror image of the night she had found him bleeding. He took one slow step forward. "Drop it. It's over." Her fingers trembled. Slowly the adrenaline began to drain, leaving nothing but cold exhaustion. The flashlight slipped from her grip, clattering against the pavement. Gabriel closed the distance. He didn't ask permission. He reached out, sliding one arm behind her back and the other under her knees, lifting her effortlessly against his chest. Cora was too tired to fight. She let her head fall against his shoulder. He smelled like bergamot and cordite. Gabriel turned and walked back to the SUV. Leo was standing by the open door, an expression of grim stoicism on his face. "Clean this up," Gabriel ordered, stepping into the warm cabin with Cora in his arms. "If Tommy wakes up, make sure he doesn't ever walk into this burrow again." "Yes, Mr. Costa," Leo said, shutting the heavy door. The SUV pulled smoothly off the curb, leaving the bloody alley behind in the dark. They didn't go to the glass penthouse. The SUV navigated through a maze of narrow industrial streets on the edge of Brooklyn, finally pulling into a heavy steel garage that locked automatically behind them. Gabriel carried her up a narrow flight of wooden stairs into a space that felt entirely different from his sterile tower. It was a sprawling loft, but it felt lived in. Exposed brick walls, heavy timber beams, a massive worn leather sofa, and shelves lined with actual red books. It smelled of old wood and faint cigar smoke. It was a fortress, but it was warm. He set her gently down on the leather sofa. "Stay," he commanded softly. Cora didn't have the energy to do anything else. She watched as he walked into an adjacent bathroom, returning a moment later with a white ceramic bowl filled with warm water, a clean towel, and a first aid kit. He pulled up a wooden stool, sitting directly in front of her. He reached for her torn coat. Cora flinched instinctively. Gabriel paused, his hands hovering in the air. He looked her directly in the eyes. "I am not going to hurt you. I will never hurt you. Look at me." Cora met his gaze. The dark, bottomless black of his eyes wasn't cold anymore. It was intensely focused, completely grounded. She gave a small, jerky nod. Gabriel gently slipped the ruined wool coat off her shoulders. He tossed it onto the floor. He took the warm, damp towel and carefully began wiping the blood from her face. His touch was shockingly gentle. For a man whose hands were built for violence, he moved with the precision of a surgeon. He wiped the dirt from her cheeks, the smear of blood off her chin. He took her hands, cleaning the scraped knuckles where she had hit the wall, applying an antiseptic ointment that stung sharply. Cora hissed, trying to pull her hand back. Gabriel held firm, blowing softly on the cuts. "You broke his nose, cleanly, with a flashlight." "He was going to kill me," Cora whispered. "He was going to try," Gabriel corrected. He finished bandaging her knuckles and dropped her hand gently. He leaned back on the stool, resting his forearms on his knees, looking at her. "Why didn't you run, Cora, when you saw him in the alley? You could have run." "I was tired of running," she admitted, leaning her head back against the leather sofa, closing her eyes. "I'm tired of being afraid of the rent, afraid of the streets, afraid of men like him." She opened her eyes and looked at him. "Afraid of men like you?" Gabriel didn't look away. "Are you afraid of me now?" Cora looked at the man sitting in front of her. He had just crippled a man without a second thought. He commanded an army of shadows. But he was also the man who had let her feed him by a dumpster, who had offered her the world on a blank check, and who was currently wiping mud off her cheap boots with a clean towel. "No," Cora said softly. "I don't think I am." Gabriel exhaled a long, shaky breath. He ran a hand through his immaculately styled hair, ruining it, making him look younger, more human. "I didn't know what to do with you." Gabriel confessed, his voice dropping to a low rumble in the quiet loft. "When you refused the money. It drove me insane. Everything in my life is a transaction. I buy loyalty. I pay for silence. I extort respect. But you wouldn't take the payment. You left me in debt." "I told you," Cora said gently. "It was a gift. I know." Gabriel leaned forward again, his dark eyes searching her face. "And I finally understand what that means. It means I can't balance the ledger. I can't buy my way out of what I owe you." He reached out his warm, rough fingers, gently tracing the line of her jaw, stopping just below her ear. His thumb brushed against her pulse, feeling the steady, calming rhythm of her heart. "I can't buy you, Cora," Gabriel murmured, his face inches from hers. "So I'm going to protect you instead. Not because I owe you, but because I want to. Because the thought of someone touching you in that alley made me want to burn this entire city to the bedrock." Cora felt a shiver run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The intensity in his voice was overwhelming. It wasn't the polished threat of a Mafia boss. It was the raw, possessive truth of a man who had finally found something he couldn't afford to lose. "I don't need a bodyguard, Gabriel," she breathed. "You don't have a choice," he replied, a faint, genuine smile finally touching his lips. "Consider it a gift." He didn't wait for her to argue. He leaned in, pressing his lips gently against her forehead. It was a fleeting, protective touch, but it felt like a brand. "Sleep," Gabriel said, standing up. "You're safe here. Nobody knows about this place. Tomorrow we figure out the rest." He walked over to an armchair in the corner of the room, sitting down in the shadows, his eyes never leaving her. Cora lay down on the heavy leather sofa, pulling a woven throw blanket over herself. The adrenaline had completely burned out, leaving her bone-tired. But as she listened to the rain start beating against the skylight above, for the first time in her life, the crushing weight of the city didn't feel so heavy. She looked into the dark corner of the room. She couldn't see Gabriel clearly, but she knew he was there. Watching. Guarding. She had saved a bleeding stranger in an alley. But as she drifted off to sleep, she realized that perhaps, in the dark, twisted logic of this city, the stranger was actually going to save her. The rules of the city are simple until you break them. Cora gave a dying man her last meal, and in return, Gabriel Costa gave her his dangerous, bulletproof heart. Their story proves that sometimes the only way to survive the dark is to let the devil stand guard. If you were hooked by this gritty, slow-burn Mafia romance, don't let the journey end here. Hit that like button, share this video with your fellow drama addicts, and subscribe to the channel right now so you never miss a story. We will see you in the next video.